The gospel reading this morning comes from Mark chapter 5. Listen now for a word from God. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with them. And a large crowd followed and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. In 1979, a very savvy marketing person came up with a slogan for the Bell Company, which later became AT&T. Reach out and touch someone. I looked at YouTube clips so that we could remind you of those ads, but I will spare you this week the Farrah Fawcett hairdos and the station wagons. But the Bell Company was onto something. Reach out and touch someone was a handy slogan that had a catchy jingle that I also will not sing for you. But the ad campaign was speaking metaphorically. If they were going to literally touch people, that could have been confusing and possibly criminal, depending on the situation. But the point was well taken, and it was a successful ad campaign because of the importance of touch. Telephones had become the go-to way to communicate with people at that time. Phones can help a grandmother hear her grandbaby babble for the very first time, or connect a couple that's hurting because they've been apart for too long. As we move forward in time, a Pew Research study shows that as of 2013 in the United States, 75% of households have internet access, and 2/3 of adults, and probably more than that of youth, have smartphones. We can text, Facebook message, Skype, tweet, FaceTime, or connect in any number of ways, but no matter what device we've come up with, I would argue that this goes all the way back to at least the telegraph. It's a substitute. They're what we use for when we can't be with a person in person. Our reading from Mark today has two different healing stories. As is Mark's habit, he starts to tell one story, then interrupts himself with another story, and then he goes back and finishes that first one. Some scholars call it a Markan sandwich, which is a good name because both parts are important in a sandwich, but you don't take them separately, you take them together. This story works best when taken together. So in the first one, a leader named Jairus comes from the synagogue, and he approached Jesus and begged Jesus to come heal his daughter who was near death. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live," he says there in verse 23. Jesus agreed to do this, and followed by a huge crowd, he started off towards Jairus' home. As the crowd pressed in closer, Jesus felt someone touch him. "Who touched me?" he said. Well, the disciples explained that since they're in the middle of a crowd, it could have been anybody bumping into him, maybe jostling him. Why was he asking? But this touch was different. It turns out that it was a woman who had been suffering from a bleeding disease for 12 years. She was healed there on the spot, and after Jesus spoke with her, he continued on to Jairus' house and raised that little girl from the dead. We have two people who have faith that Jesus can heal. The woman was as different from Jairus in society as two people could be. Jairus was a leader at the synagogue who came boldly to Jesus. He was a Jewish man that was held in high esteem. The woman, who remains unnamed in this story because she's a woman, she was the opposite. She came in fear, she was trembling. In the society that she lived in, her bleeding disease would have made her unclean, and because of her illness, anything and everyone she touched would have also been considered unclean. She came at great risk. What both had in common, though, was faith. They knew that Jesus' touch was the answer they were looking for. And in both cases, Jesus did heal. The woman's illness was healed, and Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead. Their faith that Jesus' touch was that powerful was correct. Both Jairus and the sick woman understood that in Jesus was power and healing and peace if only they could access his touch. Endless psychological studies have shown the benefit of touch. There have been case studies of people who were not touched as children, maybe you've seen those, and they grew up not knowing how to interact with others or how to trust or show affection. Physical touch is undeniably powerful. In touching and being touched, we can experience the power of God. But touch can happen in many ways, physically, sure, but also spiritually and emotionally. We use this language all the time. I was deeply touched by the note that Liam wrote me this morning and the art that went with it. It's fantastic. Or John sang a very touching song this morning. We heal each other through touch with word and deed as much as, or maybe even more than physically. There are so many things that need a healing touch. We know of our own physical needs. We talked of some during the joys and concerns this morning. Besides physical ailments, there's spiritual, psychological, and interpersonal needs. They can be with one person, or maybe between a couple of people, or in a community at large. Last week, we talked of the needed healing from racism and violence. We've talked before of the need to heal hunger and homelessness and domestic abuse and so many other ills. This week, the United States Supreme Court made some decisions, and one of those is that same-sex marriage is now legal in all 50 states. In response to that, I saw a post on my Facebook wall in my newsfeed that said, "I just can't. If you don't agree with my opinion on this decision, we can't be friends. I love you, but I don't want to be anywhere near you." Jesus calls us to love everyone, and as we read in these two healing stories today, Jesus did that from up close. He didn't ostracize those that disagreed with him and opt to love them from way over there. No, he touched them and he let them touch him. Jairus was a higher up in the synagogue. I'm certain he and Jesus had some theological differences. Being touched by the woman who was hemorrhaging put Jesus at risk of being ceremonially unclean, but Jesus loved each of these people in person with a healing touch. This is my last Sunday as the pastoral resident at First Presbyterian. I actually have a box of tissue right here. I want to thank this church for what I've learned here, but especially for what I've learned about how healing touch works. I've seen people of all ages in this church love one another. I've seen you make cookies and cards for people who are homebound. I've seen you shop for gifts for college students that aren't here at Christmas and spend time to pack those up and mail them. I've seen us serve dinners to one another for trivia nights and participate in mission trips together, both near and far. And it seems like every time I preach, I talk about Emmaus Cafe, but touching people through all these ways is a powerful, powerful thing. And on a more personal level, I know firsthand about how this church does love and how it does healing touch. I came here nervous and unsure and honestly terrified to stand on this chancel. Pam and David will testify. The support and encouragement I've gotten here has been relentless. Support has come from Pam and the people on the Pastoral Resident Committee, the rest of the staff, which Pam says I can't take with me, even though I've been plotting to take Rick and Kristen and possibly Kate and David for some time. But I have felt buoyed up and loved and strengthened by the congregation as a whole. We don't all agree on probably anything, but we love and take care of each other. Another way I've been touched here is your patience with me as I've learned. I've learned that a pastor can be modest without being insecure. I've learned that sometimes the best spiritual care we can give one another is just showing up together and maybe having one of these. I have learned about how to have endless patience with people who mix up each other's names. But I now know the difference between Mary Jo Fincham and Mary Jo Stanley, between Rick Bierman and Rich Hepker. I've learned that Paula Durham is not married to a man named Bob, but Paula Stover is. And I've finally come to the terms with the fact that when I asked Brady how the Bartholos and the Drawbaws are related, he was telling me the truth. Tammy, those are your parents. I also learned on my first Sunday here that if I looked out at you, really looked at your faces, instead of seeing you as a big, scary crowd, that I would see smiles and encouraging nods, and I'd somehow feel like everything would be okay. It would be Could you read this? It would be okay even if I fell down the chancel stairs or tripped over my gown or lit something on fire during communion, which never did happen, but it would have been okay. I've learned about welcome and inclusion and as a form of healing touch. The very first group I visited was the Prayer Shawl Ministry. They welcomed me even though I can't knit or crochet. They let me come in with my cross stitch, and when I started to forget that every Monday, they still let me come. I thought this was just a nice group of people that met on Monday afternoons, but when I delivered the first prayer shawl to a person in the hospital, I found out what healing touch can do, even in a prayer shawl. That shawl was then and continues to be a source of comfort and strength. I could go on about these, but we have limited time. I was never going to work in a church. I grew up in a pastor's home, and I know how it works, so no, I was not going down that path at all. In seminary, they would start to talk to those that have a pastoral path, and I would just tune right out because I was not going to have any part of that. But then I found you. I saw information about this pastoral residency at seminary, and I called my mother and said, "What do we know about Muscatine, Iowa?" She said, "Well, that's where Linda Hudnall's daughter, Kim, and her granddaughter, Haley, go." And I thought, well, it must not be too bad, right? And here we are, nearly a year later. I went from looking out at you on my first Sunday, terrified, to being thrilled to see many of you at my ordination last month. And I don't know if it was on purpose or a happy providence that during that service, the people from First Presbyterian of Muscatine were seated right behind me. It was like physically, I felt buoyed up during that service by you. I felt like literally you were right there and had my back. When I leave here, I'll be the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Mendota, Illinois, because the Holy Spirit works in interesting ways. Through God's grace and this church's healing touch, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, my path has changed. I've seen and experienced and understood some things here that allowed me to answer the call to be a pastor of a church. Thank you for being willing to be like Jesus and to reach out and touch me, and the pastoral residents who came before me as well, Patricia and Alex, and others you encounter along the way. Thank you for being willing over and over again to give that Jesus-like healing touch to those you're called to serve, both here at church and in the community and all around the world, no matter who they are. Thank you.